Dream of the Red Chamber is an unusual novel. It's not just a novel filled with poetry, that was actually pretty common in Imperial China. No, it's a novel that is focused around its poetry. The poetry is at the center of the book, and the best way to understand the book is through the poetry. Well, that's just one of the things that has made Dream of the Red Chamber so notoriously difficult to translate. It's just a story if you take away the poetry, and honestly, the storyline isn't really that interesting. It's the poetry that gives the book its flavor, especially the way that different characters write in different poetic styles. What you've got to understand is that the poetry that each character creates is a direct reflection of their personality. And I'm not just talking about a couple of characters, I'm talking about dozens of them. So imagine for a second if the characters in Harry Potter wrote poetry from time to time. Hermione would write flawless poems, but they'd be really rigid. Luna would write ethereal and strange poems. Professor Lockhart would write boastful but shallow poetry. Well, that's exactly what author Cao Shuiqin did in Dream of the Red Chamber. The only difference is that his poetry followed the rules and conventions of 18th century Chinese literature. Now, there are two ways to understand these poems. There's the boring way, and then there's the interesting way. I'll touch a little bit on the boring way first, mostly because people in the comments are going to lambast me if I ignore it. Now, the boring way, in my opinion, is to spend a bunch of time looking at the tonal patterns, which was the rhyming system of classical Chinese poetry. So the way to understand this is to start with the four traditional classes of tones in traditional Chinese. These four tones are different than the modern four tones. You would have to look these up for every single character to see how it's classified. The even or level tone, ping, was considered to be one general pattern of tone for the sake of poetry. The other three tones were considered to be oblique, also called zi. The most simple rhyming scheme is easy to understand. The pattern in one line is matched by the inverse pattern in the next line. So you can see this pattern in this Dufu poem. The pattern of the first line, 我破山河在, is 仄仄平平仄. The pattern of the second line, 城春草木深, is 平平仄仄平. Now, we could go through every single poem in Dream of the Red Chamber, we could look up the old tone readings, we could make a bunch of charts, but that's a really lame way to read poetry. Instead, we want to focus on the meaning of the poem and on the specific words that were used. But before we do that, I really need to say something about Chinese dialects and pronunciation. We know that Middle Chinese pronunciation was different than modern Chinese. This is obvious in part because of the constant references to finals in the old medieval Chinese rhyming dictionaries. Part of the reason we know this is because we can compare how similar words are pronounced in the various Chinese dialects, as well as in languages such as Vietnamese and readings of words of Chinese origin in Japanese and Korean. The late Swedish linguist Bernhard Karlgren did a lot of groundwork on this, learning multiple Chinese dialects himself and similar languages and then just mapping everything out. His book, Grammata Serica Recensa, was a revolutionary volume in the world of Chinese linguistics and helped pave the way for the modern understanding of how the language evolved. Now, the fascinating thing is that many of the dialects wound up preserving older, more conservative readings of characters, and if you're wondering why, I'll show you. So before her family immigrated to Taiwan a few hundred years ago, my wife's ancestors lived in a rural part of Quanzhou in Fujian province. If you take a look at the topography of that region, you'll notice all the mountains and major bodies of water. Take a step back and you'll see just how isolating the heavy terrain must have been in those days. That terrain contributed to a large variety of dialects in that part of China, most of which are completely mutually unintelligible. Now, all of that is to tell you that you'll get a better feel of the original sound of these poems if you're able to read them in a dialect, say Southern Min or Eastern Min or Cantonese or Hakka. That's because those dialects tend to preserve more conservative, older readings than modern standard Mandarin. But like I said a minute ago, we care a lot more about what the poems mean than about how they originally sounded. And today we're going to focus more on reading for meaning than on anything else. Alright, we're going to look at three different poems today from three different characters within Dream of the Red Chamber. The first poem comes from Jia Yucun, a character I've talked about a lot. Well, Jia Yucun is boisterous, proud, arrogant, and he lacks substance. He's basically Gilderoy Lockhart, but in 18th century Chinese form, and all of that shows up in this poem. Near the end of the first chapter, Jia Yucun falls in love with a maid because she looked at him once. Naturally, he decides to compose a poem for her. I mean, this is Dream of the Red Chamber after all. Now, this was around the time of the Mid-Autumn Festival, where it's customary to look up at the moon and to sigh and to think about love. Jia Yucun does just that when he's alone, and he composes this simple poem that really reveals a lot about his character. So I'll go over this line by line, reading first the Chinese and then the English. 未不三生缘，平添一短秋. I don't know if we are fated together, but my heart grows heavier every day. 门来时脸额，心去即回头. In gloom I frown alone, yet I still remember her glance at me. 自顾风前景，谁看月下愁? My shadow trembles in the wind, who would walk with me under the moonlight? 强光如有意，线上诱人楼. Moonbeams, if you hear my plea, shine first upon the room of my love. Okay, there are a few things to dig through in this poem. First of all, the sansheng at the beginning refers to the 3 lives in Buddhist reincarnation thought. That would be our past, present, and future lives. In a romantic context, Jia Yucun is basically saying that he loved this girl even before he met her. Notice in the first 2 lines of the poem that he doesn't seem to have any thoughts about what this girl is feeling. Here in the first line, my heart grows heavier every day without her. In the second line, I frown when I'm alone. In the third line, it's Jia Yucun talking about his own shadow trembling because he's alone. He longs for somebody to walk with him in the moonlight. And then finally is the old cliched hope for the moon to act as some sort of spotlight on her chamber. None of the Chinese language here is difficult to understand. I know that's kind of hard to show to those of you who don't read Chinese, but trust me, it's actually pretty simple. Now, it doesn't have to be difficult to understand, but I do want to point out that this is not a brilliant poem, nor is it intended to be. In fact, it comes off as incredibly self-centered, which is precisely the point. Now, we're going to cheat a little bit for this next part. Well, you see, the real interesting poetry doesn't really begin until much later in the book, maybe around chapter 38 or so. However, my translation is currently bogged down in all the predictive poems in chapter 5. And so, like I said, we're going to cheat. So we're jumping over to chapter 18 of the book to look at 2 different poems, one by Xue Baochai and the other one by Lin Daiyu. Don't worry too much about the old-fashioned rhyming schemes, just know that they are correctly done. What we're looking for here is the meaning behind these poems and the subtle hints about the characters of these girls that meaning shows us. So the story here is that the so-called Grand Prospect Garden, the Da Guangyuan, has just been built. To commemorate the occasion, Jia Yucun, who was now an imperial concubine, was permitted to come home for a formal visit. And to mark the occasion, 6 of the girls composed poems. Now we're only going to look at the poems by Lin Daiyu and Xue Baochai in the interest of time. This is what the original looks like in my scanned copy of the 1792 edition of the book. Now, it's not exactly written in a poetic format, as you can see. If you look at some older text with old-style punctuation like this one, you can see how the sense lines are divided between each other. But, of course, that makes it kind of hard to present these poems in a format that's easy to follow on a YouTube video. So instead, we're going to use this more modern printed version in simplified Chinese. My apologies to those of you who prefer traditional characters. I prefer them as well. However, I want to make sure that this is as easy to follow as possible, and it's just easier when the poems are arranged like poems. Anyway, let's jump in. Xue Baochai's poem is titled Ninghui Zhongrui, or Radiant Splendor Gathers Here. So it goes like this. 方圆诸上敌城西，华日相晕笼罩期。 This fragrant garden is built west of the royal city. It is bathed in sunlight and blessed with auspicious clouds. 高柳西迁迎出故，修皇时代风来移。 The tall willows rejoice as the orioles leave the valley. The slender bamboos reverently await the arrival of the phoenix. 文风已诸陈幽兮，笑话应龙归生时。 The literary grace of the emperor was spread by his evening tour, and filial devotion brightens as he returns home. 瑞早现在瞻仰处，自强何改在为此? As I look up to such divine wisdom and transcendent talent, how dare I, in my shame, presume to write more? That was a mouthful, wasn't it? Sure, it's a longer poem than Jia Yucun's poem, but don't worry too much about the length. Let's worry more about what Xue Baochai is saying. In other words, let's read into this. Okay, first of all, this is a very strict and a very orderly composed poem. The fragrant garden shows up first, west of the royal city, blessed by heaven. The emperor is referred to as a phoenix, and the trees dutifully await his arrival. The emperor's arrival spreads literary grace and filial devotion. And in the end, Xue Baochai humbly claims that her words dare not compare with his majesty. It's a formal poem, and it's reflective of her by-the-book, formal, and very Confucian conservative nature. In other words, she is Hermione Granger. She does things perfectly and by the book with both brilliance and exactness. And now we get to Lin Daiyu, and hold on to your hats because this is going to get a little wild. Lin Daiyu's poem is called Shi Wai Xian Yuan, or Fairy Haven Beyond the World. Alright, let's stop there. The title alone is completely different, right? It's almost like she wrote down the wrong homework assignment. Xue Baochai's poem was about heaven gathering here in the garden. Lin Daiyu's poem is about taking everybody out of this place and up to some place in the great beyond. That alone tells you something. Chen you ceng yue yu, xian jing bie hong chen. The emperor's tour increases our happiness, a fairy realm separated from things of the world. Jie de shan chuan xiu, tian lai qi xiang xin. It borrows from the grace of the mountains and rivers and adds fresh splendor to the scene. Xiang rong jin gu jiu, hua mei yu tang ren. The fragrances blend with the wines of the Golden Valley, and flowers charm the visitor from the Jade Hall. He xing yao en chong, gong che guo wang pin. How blessed we are to receive this royal favor. Why does the palace carriage pass by so frequently? Now, the interesting thing about Lin Daiyu's poem is that it's filled with natural references, even though it's supposedly about something that is out of this world. Okay, she calls the garden a fairy realm in the beginning, and then there's this reference to Hongchen, or to things of the world. We'll get to that in a second. The Grand Prospect Garden borrows from the mountains and the rivers. This is literal. I mean, they took in auspicious rocks and ensured that there was water in this massive garden. And it's not like the garden in your backyard. We're talking about like a national park. It was kind of like a man-made Garden of Eden, if you want to use that Judeo-Christian reference. Now, I know that's inappropriate, but it gives some of you maybe an idea. The smell blends with the wine, the flowers charm everybody. And then we are so blessed to have this visitor. But there's something cynical about Lin Daiyu's poem, something that is absolutely not present in Xue Baochai's poem. You see, Xue Baochai was all about the formality, referring to the emperor as the phoenix, describing the trees and the animals bending to his imperial will, and so on. Lin Daiyu, however, has the people borrowing from nature, not nature bending to the will of the people. And then there's this part. Alright, so Yu Tangren, the person from the Jade Hall, is clearly Jia Yucun, who is now an imperial concubine. Jingu Jiu, the wine of the Golden Valley, is a reference to the extremely opulent home of the Jia family. Remember that Lin Daiyu is a guest in this home. She's one of the few characters in this book with a true outsider's perspective. Contrast that to how she describes the garden as Xianqing Bie Hongchen, or a fairy garden separated from the world. Now, Hongchen means the mortal world. It's something you're generally trying to overcome in a Buddhist or even a Taoist sense. A good idiom for intermediate or advanced learners of Chinese to study is Kanpo Hongchen. This means to overcome the things of the world, to see through the red dust and focus instead on attaining enlightenment. But Lin Daiyu is using those terms ironically. You can't overcome the things of the world by living in jade halls or creating a man-made Golden Valley, right? It's not that the Grand Prospect Garden is some sort of miraculous work of nature. It's entirely man-made. It's entirely built with money. It's sort of like the opulent mansion castles of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. That's what Lin Daiyu is pointing out here, and she does so very subtly. And then there's this plea at the end. Why does the royal carriage come so frequently? The key word here is pin, or frequent. This hints in part at the strain that these imperial visits have put on the Jia family's finances, but it also hints at Lin Daiyu's resistance to the formality of Confucian cultural requirements. Actually, if you think about it, the whole last line clashes with the desire for transcendence, or for shenjing, that she expresses in the first line. She wants to go to the transcendent place, but she has to deal with the annoyances of the world, including the imperial visits. So, is she Luna Lovegood? Maybe, but I'd argue that Lin Daiyu goes far deeper than any of the Harry Potter characters. I told you this was deep, and honestly, we've only scratched the surface here. Anyway, to increase your understanding and enjoyment of the poems, you can look for other things, such as parallel passages. For example, Xue Baochai describes the oriole birds flying out of the valley. She then describes the phoenix arriving. The tall willow trees rejoice when the orioles leave. The bamboo trees wait reverently for the phoenix to come. In Lin Daiyu's poem, her fantastic realm borrows the mountains and rivers. It then adds to the spirit of the place. The Golden Valley wine, blended with sweet fragrance, is contrasted directly to the person from the Jade Halls who the flowers charm. Now, these parallel passages are really common in Chinese poetry, and discovering and paying attention to them can hint at the overall meaning of the poem. Anyway, in the interest of keeping this video to a somewhat reasonable length, I will refrain from jumping into a full comparison of the word choice of the three writers. Anyway, Jia Yucun again is a fraudster who can't write a love poem without making the entire thing only about himself. Xue Baochai is unmistakably Confucian in nature. Her poem is formal, proper, and a brilliant work of high literature. And Lin Daiyu comes off as a great literary master, able to express her defiance in a subtle way that is difficult to perceive at first. Anyway, all of this gives you a little taste of what's going to come in the book. We've got stuff like this really all over the place. It's kind of exciting. And this is also why I insist on going slowly. If you just speed through the book and you don't pay any attention, you're going to miss out on all the good stuff. And the poetry is where the good stuff really is.